All right, so I wanted to talk today about collective intelligence. And so, because we are here gathered in this group and we're trying to, what I would say we're trying to do is we're trying to create a form of collective intelligence. So, what is collective intelligence? It's an emergent property of a collection of entities. It's a higher order of intelligence that emerges in a group of beings. It could be people, could be animals, could be plants. Even your body is a collection of cells and different kinds of systems that are all interacting together, which is creating this emergent perception of you as a being. But all those cells might not actually realize that they're part of this collective being that is you. For example, a nerve cell just receives an impulse from one side and then it passes on the impulse to the other side. But it might not know that there's a greater being that's actually collecting all those different nerve impulses and creating this perception of you and world around you. So we might not be aware of what kind of collective intelligence and possibly even collective consciousness is emerging from our interactions here. I would say that there are a couple of different collective intelligences types that are functioning in the world right now. One of them is centralized and the other one is decentralized. So we can all get a pretty good example of what centralized collective consciousness looks like if we look at mass media. So a group of people or a person or an entity has some idea, has some set of values, some way of thinking, and they want to pass it down to the world. And a very effective way to do that is through broadcast media. And then everybody just repeats the same idea, the same way of thinking, the same framework, and everybody thinks that they are thinking independently, but what they're really doing is what Jordan Greenhall refers to as simulated thinking. They're not actually investigating what's happening, they just hear something, it resonates, with their existing values, and they're like, oh yeah, that's true, okay, and then they just pass it on. Just like the nerve cell, it receives some sort of impulse, then it doesn't think about, oh, what is this, what am I doing with this, and just passes it right on. Like, yeah, I'm a free agent. Not really. So, on the extreme side, it can result in people just being in this collective trance where they're, just receiving information and then acting on this information unconsciously, just reacting and passing it on without actually investigating. What is this information? What does it mean? So, what's really important to do here is to have a sense of sovereignty and to act from sovereignty. So yes, on some level you aren't sovereign and maybe you don't have as much free will as you think and you're just, reacting to your environment because we're all part of this greater being called humanity. But on some level you probably have some level of sovereignty, some level of free will. So how can you find that space? Well, so again, to refer to the ideas of Jordan Greenhall, there are 3 steps to getting into a place of sovereignty. First is clear perception. What is true? What is real? How do I know? And really, really ask yourself, not because, some person that I respect said this, or like some person who's done more investigation than me said this, because you don't know how they came up with that information. So do your own investigation. What is true? What is real? How the hell do I actually know? Part 2 is sense making. So, all right, this information that I, think I know, what does it actually mean? In the context of everything else in relation to other people's perspectives and other systems, what does this actually mean? And things could mean very different things if you put yourself into a different headspace. So, for example, if you identify as a politically conservative person, you might take this information and say, oh, it means this. If you identify as a politically libertarian person, you might consider it something else, etc., etc., etc. So, it's important to put yourself into different headspaces to understand that there can be a very big difference in how you perceive things depending on where you're coming from. And that there's an inherent bias in that. And that, your perspective, you might think that you're thinking logically, but actually you're still operating from different frameworks. And if you switch your framework, you might see things completely differently. So that's sense making. And then the third portion of sovereignty is agency. So what can I actually do about this? And that might not be much, but there's usually something that you can do. And again, agency is constrained by the first two things, because if you are not seeing things clearly, or if you're not clearly making sense of things, then what you're doing might actually be unconscious. You might just be, that cell that's receiving, the nerve cell that's receiving the information from somewhere else that's telling you to do something, and you're just, firing the impulse and passing it on. You're acting unconsciously. So then you refer back to the first step. Okay, what is true? What is real? What does this mean? What can I do about it? So back to the idea of collective intelligence. If we assume that we are cells in this greater being, that is, in this group, and also cells of the greater being, that is humanity, and we have some sort of agency, how can we benefit the greater being? How can we create the intelligence? How can we help create the intelligence that emerges from our collective participation? So first of all, sometimes people assume that this kind of collective intelligence is only collaborative, but that's actually not true. Collective intelligence can also emerge from competition. For example, in sports, you see this kind of thing. And I think that's also very necessary not to overlook. So it could be a combination of collaboration, competition. It's not just one or the other. Now, so I've talked a bit about the centralized form of collective intelligence. Now let's talk about the form of decentralized collective intelligence. So this is not obvious. What is the difference? So centralized collective intelligence usually is centered around some group of people or an entity that has an agenda and that wants to perpetuate that agenda by using other people as agents. Could be a political leader, a business leader, or just a person that, is very charismatic and wants to perpetuate the ideas. It is often centered around an ideology or a philosophy, and often there's a right way of thinking and a wrong way of thinking. So for example, if you get into certain political circles, certain ideas might be completely off the table, they're just considered wrong, and certain ideas are just accepted as default right. So be aware of those things. And in decentralized intelligence, it is not centered around a specific idea, so there's no kind of right way of thinking. It is not controlled by a group of people, and it is emergent. So it is kind of self-directed, it is mutating, it is not stable in any sense. So from the outside it can look chaotic, but it does have its own emergent intelligence, and we can observe this. I know I'm running out of time, but we can observe this kind of thing in what you could call meme magic, where like memes get passed through the internet and they evolve with time and they take on a life of their own. And so I would say that this is a form of decentralized collective intelligence. And the fewer bureaucracy, the fewer rules, the fewer agendas, the fewer rigid structures there are, the more it enables this kind of decentralized collective intelligence to emerge. And so I would like all of us in this group to be mindful of those things. Agendas, structures, trying to perpetuate a specific way, correct way of thinking. If we can tone that down, we perhaps can allow this decentralized collective intelligence to emerge.